Hey, welcome back to the Guillemot Kayaks Workshop. I'm Nick Schade. We're working on the microBootlegger Sport strip-built sea kayak. Today we'll be doing fiberglassing. I guess fiberglassing is not exactly the word for it. I'm going to use some Carbon-Kevlar cloth as well as some fiberglass, but I tend to use the same word for the whole thing. So we're going to be setting that in epoxy. I've got the shop warmed up to really warm, 85, 90 degrees, something like that. So I got a little bit of prep work before I actually get into the fiberglassing. I want to touch up the stain around the combing, and I need to vacuum out the boats, make sure they're all clean on the inside, and also I'm going to put some fillets in various high stress places of the boat. So the chines of the hull and the feature line of the deck, around the combing, a little bit up in the bow and stern, both deck and hull, just to ease some of those transitions and strengthen up the boat in some of the high stress places. So I'm going to start by putting fillets in the chines and around the cockpit and various other places where the sort of sharp angles. This will relieve some of the stress from on the fabric as it bends around that, and actually strengthens the boat by again relieving the stress on the fabric. So I'm just mixing up a standard batch of epoxy here, and then I'll add wood flour, etc., to make a dookie schmutz, a filleting mix. And if there's any gaps I see from the inside, I can spread those in up and down the keel line, center line, any place I see. Once I have the stuff mixed up. Since I'm going to be putting the Carbon-Kevlar on the hull at least, you're not going to see any filler that I use here. I'm going to be installing this fillet and then glassing right over it while it's still wet. That way I don't need to do any sanding, I don't need to worry about blush or any adhesion problems between the fabric coat and the fillet. I will need to be careful with the fillet because while it's wet, it's still soft, and if I go in there with a squeegee and push on it, I can mess up that fillet. I feel it's worth the risk just to get sort of a better bond with everything. It's a little bit more, so it's pretty close. I want to spread this fast because it is warm in here and I've got the epoxy heated up. I've got a little heater on my epoxy pumps that keeps the resin warm and low viscosity. So I've put the filleting mix in a piping bag. I want to get it out of the bag as fast as possible because again, it is pretty warm. So I have the scrapings here, removing the excess. I need a little bit more epoxy to finish off the boat. So I'm going to mix that in this container here. And once that's mixed up a bit, I'm going to start adding the previously mixed stuff. Then I'll add more wood flour as necessary. So I may be dripping epoxy on the interior of the combing ring here where I have removed the stain. So to make sure that I get everything uniformly covered with stain, I want to take and touch up this edge where I'd sanded, or where I'd done the round over and sanding. And to even that stain out, give it a little bit of a alcohol treatment. Then to clean up some of these fillets, I'm going to wipe them down with a little bit of denatured alcohol also. That just smooths stuff out. Helps blend in the blobs. So make sure there's enough to get all the way in, and then we'll trim off the excess. I decided to go with the Carbon-Kevlar around the cockpit. It was just basically logistics. So I'm wetting out the Kevlar basically the same way you wet out fiberglass. It's just making the fabric wet. The primary difference between the Kevlar or carbon fiber and the Carbon-Kevlar versus regular fiberglass is these exotic fibers absorb a lot more resin. So as such, you don't save weight by using them. This is a 6-ounce Carbon-Kevlar cloth I'm using here. Here I'm using a 4-ounce E-glass or a 4-ounce S-glass. So if you just take the fabric itself, 6 ounce per square yard, 4 ounce per square yard. Obviously the fiberglass is lighter. And then you have the Carbon-Kevlar, which is a low density material. So that 6-ounce cloth is a lot thicker than 6-ounce fiberglass would be. And as a consequence, especially in a hand layup, it sucks up a whole lot more resin. As a consequence, when I'm mixing up the batches, I'm mixing up bigger batches. And I poured it in there and I spread it on thick. I didn't try and make it go a long way. Where the fiberglass, I try and make go a long way. You got to give the cloth time to soak up the resin. It doesn't just soak it up immediately. Even the glass, if you watch it, the first time you swipe over it, it ends up a little bit gray. It needs a little bit of time to suck up the epoxy. I lay it on pretty thick, and then I look at it. When the fabric's completely wet out, it's got a dark, even tone to it, where when it's partially saturated, it looks a little dry and it'll tend to be a little bit blotchy. Things will appear to be wet, but if you look at it compared to surrounding areas, you'll see it doesn't reflect quite as much. It looks a little bit starved. With the glass, it's obvious. When it's clear, it's wet out, done. Then it's just a matter of, do you have too much epoxy on? Where with the Carbon-Kevlar, it doesn't really change color, it changes tone a little bit. And as a consequence, you've got to be patient with it, and you've got to really look at it and get low raking light on it, see how it's reflecting, See how it's reflecting the light behind it. When I'm doing the hull, I just pour it in, large batches and then spread those around, bringing them all the way up to the side. It's really easy to not get all the way up to the part line. As you drag the pool of resin up the side, more and more of it gets soaked into the cloth, and by the time you get to the top edge, there might be nothing left behind your squeegee. And so you really need to make a point to make sure you're getting a full squeegee load of epoxy all the way up to the top. I overlapped the ends of the cloth, so again, starting in the middle going out, as I pulled the resin down, I ended up coming back and overlapping it, so as I pull the squeegee's not grabbing the edge of the next layer. It's pulling over the top of that layer and pulling it down, so I can pull that cloth tight down towards the ends. Once I've let it soak in a while and it's time to come back with the grunge cup, especially with a pretty hard chine, it really wants to bridge in that chine area. And so as you're squeegeeing, it's going to lift up out of the chine, or you should expect it to. And so when you're done squeegeeing, you got to see if it's lifted up out of the chine, and then feed cloth back into it. Again, if you're bringing cloth up this curve and you've got a hard angle on it and you tug the cloth, it wants to lift out of that chine area. And so you want to make sure you don't just jam your squeegee back in there, because you'll mess up that soft fillet we put in. You want to take and feed the cloth back down into that corner and make sure it settles all the way in. And take your finger, you'll hear sort of a popping noise. If there's air trapped behind it, you'll hear a little as you're moving your finger across it. That means that there's air under it. You may well have sufficient epoxy there. You just need to get the air out from underneath the cloth to the outside of the cloth. And so with that grunge cup, you're going to expect to get some bridging like that. So do your grunge cupping, then come back and push the cloth down into that chine. Make sure it's fully down into the chine. With the deck, I started with the combing area. The combing area is always the hardest. There's a lot of contour to get around there. It doesn't want to stretch. You've got to take advantage of the ability of the warp and weft of the cloth to slide relative to each other. And so I always wet out the cloth first, pushing it down into sort of the lowest point. In this case, that perimeter around the cockpit recess where the combing recess hits the deck proper. And I put a fillet down in there, and I'm pushing the cloth down into that filleted area and making it really conform there. Then I start spreading it up the sides and make sure it gets completely saturated up the sides. When I was glassing the outside, I never took the brush and tried to wet out the whole surface of the cloth completely with the brush. Basically, with glass, the brush holds way more epoxy than the glass can absorb. However, with the Carbon-Kevlar, the brush holds just about enough to wet out the cloth. So I will completely wet out the cloth with the brush, or very nearly so. I hit every surface of the Carbon-Kevlar with the brush before I come back and squeegee it. And that way, hopefully I have enough resin on that cloth. And again, inspect the color, get down in the light, look for places where it's bridging, where there's a little pucker, funny shapes. And you want to push those down and make sure there's enough resin under it. It does take some time for the cloth to absorb all the resin and for that resin to propagate completely through the cloth into the wood. In order for the cloth to be considered completely wet out, the wood behind it has to be wet out. We are gluing the cloth to the wood. If the wood's not wet, the glue's not touching the wood, the cloth is not glued to the wood. Look along the perimeter, make sure there's no places where the cloth is pulled away from the edge. Get your eye down and look down the length of the cloth. Look for places where the tone of the fabric looks a little bit lighter, where it's not quite as reflective, where it's a little bit more sort of yellowish as opposed to a greenish. When it's really wet out, it's going to look green with the black of the carbon fiber and the yellow of the Kevlar together. For some reason, when it's not quite wet out, it looks a little bit yellower, and it's a little bit lighter in color, and you want to come back and brush a little bit more onto that area and then squeegee it off. When I get to the fiberglass, it's pretty much the same process as we did on the outside, but bridging happens all the time. So bridging is when I'm pulling the cloth, squeegeeing it, trying to get rid of the excess resin. It pulls the cloth tight and it starts to lift up out of those low concave sections. It's going to happen. You're trying to remove resin. As a consequence, you're going to be pulling on the cloth, and as you tug on that cloth, it's going to lift out of that concave section, and so you're going to have to go back and push it down. Don't stop every time you see it happen and try and deal with it. So when I'm working on the back deck, where it really happens easily between the feature lines there, I go ahead and just do both sides, get all the bridging to happen, then come back and fix it. Because every time you do that squeegee, it's going to cause some bridging. So you want to get it all done quickly, and then it's easy to come back and deal with the bridging. The bridging is really easy to deal with. It doesn't have to panic you every time it lifts off. Just say, okay, I know what's going on there. I'll come back and get that soon enough. I'm going to leave this to set for a while and try and squeegee on a fill coat later tonight. It's about 3:30 now. This will take a few hours to start to set up a bit, and then I'll come back and squeegee on another coat to start to fill the weave. So the epoxy is set up for a few hours now. It's about 5:30, and it's just barely tacky on the hull and slightly tacky on the deck. So it's time to give it a light fill coat. I don't try and fill the weave on the interior of the boat in the same way I do the exterior. The exterior I want all nice and shiny, you know, look really great. On the interior, I'd like to leave a little texture so things aren't slippery in there so much. And I want to save as much weight as possible, so I don't want to just completely bury the weave in epoxy. Like I did on the hull, where I just gave it a light fill coat, I'm going to give the interior a light fill coat. I'll squeegee that on. I'll add a little bit of the colloidal silica to the epoxy just to help it stick in place a little bit more. Not enough to make it cloudy particularly, and you know, I'm not making it thick really. I'm just trying to make it so it has a little bit more inclination to stay where I put it. And I'm driving it in with the squeegee to help push it down into any pinholes or anything like that. So it's just going to be a quick once over, hull and deck, and then we'll be done for the day. All right, I got the fill coat in. It's all squeegeed out. So, you know, enough to get down into the weave, but I'm not trying to build up a lot. So put it on, squeegee off the excess. It all looks good. Looks like it came out well. The carbon Kevlar can always be a little bit tricky. Again, it's hard to know when you've really gotten it wet out. I think I did a good job. So I haven't really thought beyond today as far as what I'm going to do. I got to figure out what I'm going to do tomorrow. I'll trim off the excess glass and carbon fiber. I'll start working on getting glass wrapped around the combing. So if you've got any questions about this whole process, feel free to post them in the comments. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. If you're liking this whole series, hit subscribe, turn on notifications. But until the next episode, thanks for watching and happy paddling. So this Kevlar is pretty tough stuff when it's all hardened up. So if I can trim it off while the epoxy is sort of at a leathery green cure stage, it's a lot easier. Knife will cut right through it.